and hello. My name is Antje Boyens. I'm here from Frankfurt Rhine-Main Theater Regional Group. A warm hello to everybody. I lead this group with Rudy, but Rudy today is in another position. So my co-moderator is today Judith Mader, and I think you see her too. Yeah. And I'm, again, like we did it on most of our moving online events before, I'm saying something about the Zoom use.
Thank you very much, Antje and Judith. Before I start, I would like to mention these three words I will use: discourse, and I would emphasize the last two words. Discourse refers to social practice, and I'll come back to that. Mediation will play a role when we look at what the Council of Europe has to say to intercultural communication. The definition given here may seem a bit abstract, but I'll do my best to make it more understandable by giving examples, etc. And English as a lingua franca will play a role in the final part of this presentation when I'll be presenting 3 examples of practical training modules. The point about it is that English as a lingua franca has become an extremely interesting field of research over the last 15 to 20 years now. And sometimes there is a basic misunderstanding. English as a lingua franca is not an additional, an extra variety of English in addition to British English and American English, for example. No, it's the very opposite. It's the great variety which defies standardization. And that raises, of course, questions: what do you teach and how do you deal with it, in particular in intercultural encounters? These are the 4 points I would like to address during this webinar. The first point refers to the concept of national cultures, which has a very long tradition, of course, and the question will be, is it still helpful, or if no, why not, and if yes, in what way? The second subject refers to this definition: cultures defined as discourse communities. What does that imply, and how does it relate to different manifestations and viewpoints when we talk about culture? The third point refers to the Council of Europe and what it has to say in this context, and of course, what role does it play in the field anyhow? And finally, I'll give you 3 examples of practical training, as I mentioned before. But let me start with a fable from ancient India, which is the fable of the 6 wise blind men. The 6 wise blind men one day met an elephant. And since they were blind, they tried out, each in his own way, what they were meeting actually. And the first, well, he touched the trunk and said, oh yes, it's a snake. And the second one touched the tusk and said, no, 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 it's a spear. The third one touched one of the ears and said, no, it's a fan. And the next one touched the tail and said, no, it's a rope. And the next one touched the leg and said, no, it's a tree. And the last one said, oh, nonsense, it's a wall. You probably understand why I start with this fable, because in the intercultural field, all of us, myself included, of course, may resemble one or all of these blind, wise men. But then, on second thought, the elephant doesn't really represent our subject that well, does it? Culture. Culture is in us, and we are in culture. And that's the basic difference. So if we stick to the metaphor of an elephant, perhaps the elephant in the room might be more fitting in this context. So we are in the elephant and the elephant is in us. And that's quite an embarrassing and difficult situation to bear with. And we find it extremely difficult to address the subject of the elephant, because we are in it and the elephant is in us. In the history of philosophy, this dilemma has often been called the hermeneutic circle, meaning that we use as tools what actually want to achieve as an object, which is reason expressed in language. So that's a dilemma. We find it extremely hard to get on with it. We don't find the language for it because we are in it and culture is in us. So it begins and ends with language. And in our case, actually with a noun. Because when 2000 and more years ago in Rome, they started using the word cultura, they actually meant agricultura. And they referred to the plantations and to the crops they harvested and the tools they had developed in this context. So they were absolutely right in using a noun because all these things were tangible. Several centuries later, wise blind men further north in Europe referred this term cultura to something completely different, to features of human communities. And they stuck to the noun. And that's where the confusion started. Because until today, in every language I have any knowledge of, we use a noun to describe what we want to describe. It's die Kultur in my own native language, the culture, la culture, la cultura, etc. So always a noun. And you could, of course, ask, isn't culture doing culture, as Brian Street argued back in 1993? And isn't a noun absolutely inappropriate in this context? And Brian Street defined culture as an active process of mutual meaning making. And if we look at culture in such a way, we are in the field of social constructivism. Social constructivism, as you know, starts from the assumption that everything we take as real has been co-constructed in communication and interaction. This approach, by the way, provides a plausible answer to the dilemma we've been faced with the hermeneutic circle, which I mentioned a moment ago. And it also provides, let's say, an outlook to answer the question often asked in our field, how do languages and cultures relate? So if that is our approach, and I'm suggesting this actually, we have to find out whether it holds with all kinds of ways of looking at cultures. There are several ways of looking at culture, and one I like very much is the zooming in way. So if you look at, let's say, Europe, from a Chinese point of view, this tiny little patch of land at the end of the large Euro-Asian continent may seem a homogeneous cultural spot. But the closer we get, that is, the more we know, the more we get aware that this is so culturally diverse as it could be. And the same goes about France, which we just flew over a moment ago. From the distance, it might seem one homogeneous cultural patch. But the closer we get, that is, the more we know how diverse, culturally speaking, France is. And it also goes about Paris. Should we assume that a city of 12 million is made up of one culture, the Paris culture? What about, let's say, the working classes, the university professors, corporate cultures? Zooming in into cultures has a great effect on what we see. And that's why I find this extremely helpful. Another way of looking at cultures, and not forgetting the zooming in, refers to different manifestations of cultures. It begins with artifacts like architecture, food, technology, dress, music. Another aspect would be non-verbal behavior, for example, use of space, proxemics, body language, silence. And then, of course, verbal behavior, and that's where languages come in, but not so much languages as a linguistic system, but as social action. And that is why politeness plays a role in this context. Implied meaning, or prosody. If you're not from languages, you might not be sure what prosody refers to. It's the way we actually use language in speaking, like intonation, stress, rhythm, etc. And then there's patterns of cognition. And there's this field of intercultural studies which compares Western cultures with Eastern cultures. They very often focus on these aspects. I personally have a feeling we don't need to look that far, actually. We find these differences within Europe, but they're actually they do exist. And then there are perceptual elements like beliefs, values, and attitudes. And I marked values red because over the last 30 years, a lot of intercultural research and, to the best of my knowledge, a lot of intercultural training focused exclusively on values and more or less disregarding all other aspects. Perhaps at best drawing on one of these things to provide evidence for the theories they had been developing. So there are different ways of looking at culture, the zooming in factor and the different manifestations. And one of the oldest and longest established ways of looking at cultures was equating them with nation states. And that is, in fact, a very long tradition, as you can see from this chart, which is actually 300 years old. And I'm afraid you can't read this antiquated German. It comes from the southern part of today's Austria. In the top line underneath those well-dressed gentlemen, you see the countries like Spanien, Frankreich, etc. And in the left column, you see features that are typical for these nations. And I'll give you a few examples. This marks Lieben, what people in a specific country love and like. So we Germans like drinking. The English like lust. The Swedes like excellent food. The Poles like aristocracy. And the Hungarians like rioting. This is an excellent example, I find, of our Germanic drive and establishing order in a chaotic world. It's not only amusing, it's also ludicrous in many ways, but interesting under historical point of views. But have you really come far from this? And I ask this question by just giving you this one chart, and you'll probably all recognize it immediately. This is taken from one of the most influential books published by Gerd Hofstede, and these lists of nations referring to the position of a nation in relation to one cultural dimension index, in this context, power distance index. I would like to take up what Uli Kühnen, Professor Kühnen, said in his webinar together with Nadine Binder as part of this series of webinars about Hofstede. Hofstede needs to be accredited for making us aware that there are psychological dimensions that are culturally diverse. And that hadn't been addressed in the same way before him. But at the same time, he was criticized and challenged from the very beginning on for relating these two nations as documented in the list and as documented on these world maps, which are still available on his website. Hofstede, as you probably know, sadly passed away in February, but they're still available, as I said. Should we really believe that these large patches of land represented by one color are actually so homophobe in terms of a cultural dimension? Should we really believe this? I have the feeling that in the intercultural training field, Hofstede's contributions are still extremely influential. And the relationship between nations and cultures has often been left open. So I would like to address this briefly using one example near home, Switzerland. You all will know that Switzerland is comprised of at least 4 language communities, the German-speaking, the French-speaking, the Italian-speaking, and Rätoromansch-speaking. Beyond these 4 language communities, you have a clearly Protestant and Catholic divide in the country. And if you travel through Switzerland, you'll find that, let's say, a village in the northern part of Switzerland looks so completely different to villages in the southern parts. And you find similar things when you look at the cuisine, compare it west to east or north to south. How is it that one of the smallest nations in Europe shows such great diversity in terms of cultural markers? The answer to this takes us back to history and actually to 1815, because Switzerland, as we know it today, is a fairly young nation. It originated after the Napoleonic Wars and after the Congress of Vienna. Before 1815, what is now Switzerland had been involved in numerous European wars, as all other parts of Europe too, and even internal wars between Protestants and Catholics. It was only after 1815 that the then newly established Swiss nation committed themselves to strict neutrality, and they profited over 200 years from that. Rising standards of living and an extraordinary level of social stability, and a growing and strong sense of national identity. So the point is, nations are political, legal, administrative constructs accounted for by historical narratives. A national identity is supported by what you could call mythical narratives. In the case of Switzerland, for example, the Rütli Oath. Well, there's a strong case to argue that this never happened, this episode, but the narrative in itself adds to stabilize national identity. And you find similar mythical narratives with every nation. So the point I'm making is nations and cultures are definitely not identical. But they have one thing in common, and that is they have narratives. And I wrote history the way I did to make clear that history telling and storytelling are essentially one and the same. But the narratives in the field of nations and cultures can be very different. If you're interested in more evidence, I would recommend actually this series of podcasts provided by BBC Radio 4. Switzerland is one of the topics, but many, many other European countries and how they were invented are the subject of this. So if we adopt this approach to culture, which we would call discourse communities, does it really hold with all aspects of culture, as, for example, suggested on this list? I would choose as one example, looking at it from a macro point of view, architecture. And of course, you all know this building. But my question is, why are neoclassical buildings always white? And not only this one in Washington, but all over Europe and all over the world, neoclassical buildings are white. And so are statues and sculptures in the neoclassical or classical style. They're always white. Why is that so? Historians agree, after all, that back in ancient Athens, temples and statues were colored, as given in this example. So why are they all white today? The answer refers to this fellow countryman, Johann Winckelmann, who in his later years had the fortune to work in the Vatican's archives in Rome. And when working there, he published this book, which actually started off a new genre. It's the first history of art book ever. This book became extremely popular in Europe and beyond. And interestingly enough, in this book, Winckelmann not only gave a list of all kinds of buildings he found in Rome and in the Vatican or sculptures, but he also developed an aesthetic theory. And based on his aesthetic theory, the highest level of aesthetic perfection had been reached in ancient Athens. And the marking feature of the high level of aesthetic art was whiteness. It's important to add that Winckelmann never had been to Athens. But this book became so influential that until today, everyone believes neoclassical buildings need to be white, as is true for the Parliament building in Athens and the University of Athens building nowadays. So cultures are discourse communities, and we are still part of it today. Just imagine what people would think if anyone suggested today the White House in Washington should be painted along the model of the temple we saw a moment ago. When we come to non-verbal and verbal behavior, we are in the microsphere of intercultural discourse, intercultural research, but certainly that is the field of intercultural training. We may ask, before we go into this, how do these different levels of cultures relate to one another? And this is where Jürgen Bolton, in his webinar, in the series of these webinars, suggested this model. And I'm only commenting on the one on the bottom left. And if you can see this, an individual called A or an individual called B, C, D, or E, they all relate to different Kulturen. So each one of these individuals relate to different cultures at the same time. And that is an eye-opening point. We argue along these lines, we don't call them cultures, but discourse communities. And this is actually just a visualization of something that was suggested in the book given at the bottom of the slide. Mr. Kim from Seoul, he is a member of the Korean language community. He relates to generational discourse, to gender discourse. Of course, Confucian community of values plays a role, corporate culture and professional culture, all these play a role. So the way an individual is composed of the different discourse communities he or she relates to makes up a large and important part of a person's identity. So since we look at the microculture, dimension of culture, we need to look at what we do when we communicate. And this may seem banal, but one of the things that has been accepted in all academic fields, to the best of my knowledge, tends to be forgotten. And to cut a long story short, I just quote this one book, Pragmatics of Human Communication, which actually appeared 50 years ago, written by Václavík, Beaven, and Jackson. And these three authors suggested 5 axioms of human communication, the first 2 of which are relevant for us in the intercultural field. First one you are absolutely familiar with. We cannot not communicate. No matter what we do or don't do, no matter what we say or don't say, will be interpreted. It bears meaning. The second axiom relates directly to the first one. And that is, whenever we communicate, and remember we cannot not communicate, we do sometimes exchange information, sometimes. But what we always do is we negotiate our identities, roles, and relationships. And relationships, I would want you to keep that in mind because we'll come back to that again and again. That is the key of communication theory as is accepted and has been accepted in practically all parts of academic discussion, which I'm familiar with. That implies that on the basis of co-constructing meaning, it is trust building, it's relationship building in an initial phase of getting to know one another that is crucial and on which intercultural communication should pay particular attention. Trust building in an initial phase connects directly with what Helen Spencer-Oty spoke about in her webinar, which she gave in this series. Politeness is not a list of do's and don'ts. Politeness is very much context bound, and politeness is relevant in the first phase of getting to know one another. Once we know somebody very well, almost anything goes. But the initial phase is crucial for trust building. Politeness scales exist in every culture, but unfortunately they are asynchronous. What may be absolutely polite in my culture may be absolutely unacceptable in another culture. Relationship building, trust building, that's the focus. And this brings me to the Council of Europe. You may ask, of course, what the Council of Europe has to do in this field anyhow, because it's a political body, and there are at least 3 answers to that. First of all, the Council of Europe is not the European Union. The Council of Europe is based in Strasbourg, not in Brussels. The Council of Europe was established in 1949 and today has 47 member states, many more than the EU. And perhaps the most important distinction is the Council of Europe is absolutely powerless. All they can do is publish declarations, publish documents, and see what comes of it. And their powerlessness may turn out, in some cases, to be extremely powerful, actually. as was the case with this document, which was published in 2001, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. Usually we use the abbreviation CEFR. This has become extremely influential. And one of the reasons it became so influential was that the Council of Europe is powerless. It cannot indoctrinate anyone. And how influential it became can be seen from the number of 40 translations that exist today. And if I say translations, they're usually government-issued translations. So the impact this book had on public education, the influence it had on public education, both in Europe and beyond, cannot be overestimated. But that's only one part of the story. To give you more details about the impact this book had on language teaching, I have asked Judith Mader to come in and help me because she's much more experienced than I am. So Judith, it's now your turn.
Hello everybody, my name's Judith Mader and I'm here to say something from the perspective of a language teacher, a teacher trainer, and about language teaching and language learning. I've been involved with language teaching, primarily the teaching of English, of course, for the last about 40 years, and was also the head of a language department at a university where I was responsible for all the languages that were taught. However, in the last 20 years, I've also been very closely linked to intercultural training, and I've come more and more to feel that the difference between language teaching and intercultural training is very much one of degree rather than essence. I expect that in this context, theatre, most of you identify at this particular moment as intercultural trainers. And so you may be surprised to learn that this document, which not only language trainers but also intercultural trainers see basically as something about language, is actually about intercultural competence. That's why there's an exclamation mark. And in fact, maybe could be seen to be the missing link that Rudy refers to between language and intercultural training. So what I would like to do is from the viewpoint of a language teacher to dispel some misconceptions about the CEFR, which you may have, and which sadly still prevail today. So you can consider yourself as a language teacher at this point, or as someone who's learned a language, whichever language that may be. One of the things that everybody knows about the CEFR, if they know anything, is the terms for the levels from A1 to C2. And probably most of you would use one of these to describe your level in a certain language, which is not the language you grew up with. I'd just like you to think for a moment how you define this, assuming that you don't know the entire document very well. How do you define your own language competence in a language that you've learned? You may think it's something to do with a certificate that you've achieved at school or in another context, the number of hours that you've learnt the language, the accuracy of your grammar, for instance, how much grammar you know, or the number of words you know. The way you pronounce the language, do you sound like a so-called native speaker? I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And you may also assume that this is how language competence is defined. But in fact, it's not. It's much, much more than that. And in the Common European Framework, I'm still referring to the 2001 document. We will come back to the companion volume a little bit later. Language competence is defined not only in these terms, the standard terms, but in many different ways. And you can see some of them here, some examples of the individual scales going from A1 to C2 in the Common European Framework of Reference. There are altogether 54 scales. And you may, again, be surprised to find out that of these 54 scales, only 4 of them are concerned with accuracy. And by accuracy, I mean what language teachers like to think of as mistakes. Often these are considered grammatical mistakes, and one of the 4 scales is grammatical control, it's called grammatical accuracy. Vocabulary mistakes, another scale is range of vocabulary. pronunciation, phonological control, the way you pronounce words and stress and intone sentences. And then the fourth one, orthographic control, writing, spelling, punctuation. But these are only 4. And just to take 4 of the scales on this slide, you can see that they're related not so much to language in the traditional sense, but far more to communication. I'm not denying that the 4 things that I've mentioned, grammar, vocabulary, writing, accuracy, and pronunciation, are unimportant. They're certainly important at the early stages of a language, where you have to get an idea of the structure of the language and get your head and your mouth around the way the language is pronounced, and know the words for the things you want to talk about. But once you've got that, got a grip on that to a certain extent, the main thing is to be able to communicate what you want to say. And for that, you need a whole lot more. In order to build trustful relationships, as Rudy just referred to them, you will need more than just grammar and vocabulary. You'll need some of the things here. You'll need to cooperate with people in order to reach certain objectives together. You'll need to understand the difference between formality and informality. These are just 2 of the scales that you can see on this slide. You'll need to be able to ask for clarification if you don't understand something. All the scales you can see here are important for forming trustful relationships, whatever these relationships may be. In forming friendships, business relationships, romantic relationships, platonic relationships, and any other forms of relationships that you want to make. And these relationships will succeed or fail, not on the basis of the grammatical mistakes you make or the use of a wrong word, but rather on the various things that I've just mentioned. So the mistakes that you make are described here in this particular scale, sociolinguistic appropriateness. At level B2, a user of the language should be able to sustain relationships with native speakers. I'll say something about native speakers in a minute, because that term has been taken out of the companion volume, which basically replaces or complements the original document. Can sustain relationships without unintentionally amusing or irritating the person that they're speaking to. And the definition of mistakes that I would use at any stage of learning the language, long before B2, would be that a mistake is only important if it causes misunderstanding, if it irritates, causes offense, or unintentional amusement. And the second and the third of those, irritation and offense, are definitely, in my view, the most serious. And it will not be the grammatical mistakes that cause this irritation or offense. So, and B1, as you can see in the same scale, is aware of the salient politeness conventions and acts appropriately, which is more or less the same thing. Doesn't make mistakes of politeness, which lead to irritation or offense. So this definition of mistakes is definitely not my own. It's taken from the Common European Framework, but it's one that I've used and explained to learners with great success at all language levels. It helps them to realize why they're using the language, to dispel some of the things that were drummed into them at school, that it's not what you say, but how you say it, and that grammatical mistakes are the most important thing. So this, it may well not be new to many of you, but the CEFR put it into words in 2001, and these words have sadly not yet had absolutely the desired effect. Language teachers and intercultural trainers are equally surprised that this is a document not only, or maybe not at all, about languages, but about intercultural communication and intercultural competence. So it's definitely instrumental, both for language trainers, and is far more than the 6 levels that are described in it, but it's also instrumental, I would maintain, we would maintain, and that's why it's in this presentation, for intercultural trainers as well, in thinking about defining and considering all the different aspects of intercultural communication, what they mean, and how the language that we use definitely influences our ability to form trustful relationships in intercultural contexts. companion volume to this, which has just come out, 2018-1920, goes quite a long way further, but I'll be handing back to Rudy now to describe that, as he was one of the two official translators of that volume, and so has read it all much more carefully than I have. So thank you for that little appearance, and back to Rudy.
Thank you very much, Judith. The gist of it is the CFR, on the one hand, was a success story, and on the other hand, a not so successful story. And that was the reason why the Council of Europe between 2014 and 2017 started a first revision project, which involved over 1,500 experts Europe-wide, 300 institutions, most of them university institutes, hundreds of validation workshops, and 60, more than 60 actually, pilot projects. This setup of this revision project in itself speaks for a high level of validity, with so many experts Europe-wide being involved. And secondly, it promises impact once again, perhaps even more so than after 2001, because so many institutions, so many governments were involved and have taken part. And this would be the subject of an extra session, but one point might be of special interest for intercultural trainers and intercultural researchers, and that is the completely new chapter on mediation. And here's again the definition of mediation given in the document itself. It might seem a bit abstract, but actually it refers to social constructivist approaches, as we've indicated before. The co-construction of meaning in interaction, myself in interaction with my discourse communities. We always have to negotiate meaning with one another. And the more we are familiar with one another, the higher the chances that we really understand what the sender of the message is trying to express. And this movement, the co-construction of meaning in interaction and constant movement between individual and social levels, that is what this chapter looks at. And of course, you will all have your own definition of mediation. And in most cases, it's the conflict mediation thing, two people being in conflict and one mediator being in between and trying to help both sides understand each other better. That is one aspect of it indeed, but only one, because the construct of mediation suggested by the Council of Europe is absolutely innovative, new, and extremely interesting for intercultural trainers. And once again, I have to cut myself very short, but I would like to point out a few things which might make it clear why I feel the way I do. First of all, the top boxes are headlines, whereas the boxes inside the red and blue oval lines actually represent scales of descriptors from A1 through C2. And the main distinction is between cognitive mediation on the one hand and relational mediation on the other. One example for cognitive mediation, if you can read it, the top box under mediating a text is relaying specific information, which means I express in my own words what I've read or heard to explain things to somebody who hasn't understood or hasn't heard or read it. That is exactly the construct of mediation that has arrived in secondary schools in Germany, in Austria, and as far as I know, in Italy and Spain, etc., based on the Common European Framework of 2001. It's actually part of the school finishing examination in Germany, Abitur in Germany, and Matura in Austria. This is one aspect of it, but perhaps the most interesting parts of it belong to the relational mediation. And I would like to give you two examples from that field. There's one scale called Facilitating Pluricultural Space. I must say I like the image. And one of the descriptors I would like to draw your attention to. At B1, a speaker can act in a supportive manner in intercultural encounters, recognizing the feelings and different worldviews of other members of the group. That is, of course, meta language. It can't be taught, but it needs to be underlain with teaching material. And here's one example how we use it in our training courses. Imagine you have been working in Beijing for 1 year and a Chinese business partner speaking English congratulates you on your Chinese. And having learned the British American discourse conventions in English, your answer might be this. Unfortunately, based on a Confucianist context, your Chinese business partner might expect you to answer along the lines of C, refusing to accept a compliment, showing modesty. And to be quite clear, this is not only the fact in China, but in many parts of the world. You don't accept compliments in many cultures. So one way of learning a strategy which allows me to remain myself and still comply with the expectations on the other side as far as I can would go along these lines as suggested under B. This is the kind of discourse that can be taught and learned and practiced. Another example refers to business correspondence. To the best of my knowledge, most students in Germany anyway, learn business correspondence along the Anglo-American style, which is outlined in the left column. But in large parts of the world, not only in China, Indonesia, and Japan, completely different discourse strategies are required in order to establish a positive relationship. We'll come back to relationship building again and again. This is not taught in most cases, neither in Germany nor in any other European country I have any knowledge of. Actually, students I've been teaching in this field found this was a bit of bootlicking, if you know what I mean. It's just not our style. But this is exactly what we need to learn and open up learners to accept and to find their middle way to comply with expectations on the other side so as to be able to establish trusting relationships. My final example is taken from this scale. It's called facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements. Here are two descriptors from this scale. At B1, a speaker can ask parties in a disagreement to explain their point of view and can respond briefly to the explanations provided the topic is familiar to him or her and the parties speak clearly. A level higher, B2, a person can summarize the statements made by the two sides, highlighting areas of agreement and obstacles to agreement. Now, to give you an example where this might be necessary, we asked a colleague from the SIATA Regionalgruppe Frankfurt, who is an intercultural mediator, to give us an example from his professional expertise. And we'll show you 2-minute excerpt of this interview, but for this purpose, I need to start the video separately. So allow me a few seconds.
I have an example where I was involved. I would not mention names of companies or persons. It was a German company looking for a cooperation or looking for a joint venture with a local Indonesian company to start production and to sell their products in the country itself. And generally what was happening, it turned out that the Indonesian company was taking on the German products, assembling it and then selling it in the country. So the first clash, or not the first clash, the level of communication was that the Indonesians were accepting everything that the Germans were saying or wanting to implement in terms of technology, in terms of specification, that was okay. But the only thing that was different from the Indonesian way of doing things is that people. The Indonesian had put someone into a position who did not have the profile, who did not have the qualification to do this job, and this person could not communicate with the German parties. And the Germans were quite disappointed with this, and they told the Indonesians, look, you put this unqualified person in this position, and this person is not helping us at all in terms of progress. The Indonesian said, yes, he is not qualified right now, but we are training him and would like to put him on the job so that he gains his qualification. And by the way, he's my cousin, so he's related to me, and I would like him to take on the responsibility. And this is where the Germans could not understand it, why someone who is not qualified for the job is doing the job, and yeah, it goes into neopolitism. That means you're bringing in family and friends into the business. But anyway, that was his first clash.
I'm not quite sure whether you could understand him, only vaguely. Let me summarize it then in my own words. He talks about business cooperation between a German and an Indonesian company who had agreed on specific roles and obligations and duties and rights. And of course, what kind of qualifications people involved in the cooperation should have to take over that position. And in one case, they found that a young man was installed in a position who clearly didn't have that qualification. And when they discussed that in dispute with their Indonesian partners, one of them said, and by the way, this young man is my cousin. This is real life. And when we interviewed Param, this was one of the projects he had been involved in at that very moment. There were two scales of values clashing. The German value scale said, we have a contract. You have signed and agreed to do the following and not to do other things. But you have broken our contract. So we'll stop our cooperation or you pay a high fine. Anyway, the situation can't go on like this. The Indonesian side sees it completely differently. For them, it is a moral obligation to help a member of the family into a professional position, provided you have the possibility to do so. And if you don't, you are not a moral person. And for them, it is an open question whether they want to do business with people they consider fundamentally immoral. The point in this example is that the people involved in a clash like this could and perhaps should learn the communicative skills to settle such clashes among themselves, in a way doing the job which Param did in their case. And what is needed in this context is described in detail by the CFR companion volume, something that has never existed before and which will be extremely helpful in designing and training curricula. So to sum it up, the language of mediation does include knowledge about different perceptions of reality, different value systems, different ways of dealing with things. The language of mediation also includes a certain openness and acceptance of otherness. It presupposes language skills, as Judith said, in terms of vocabulary, grammar, and sufficiently understandable pronunciation. And it includes awareness of the context in every sense of the word, including cultural ones. And the skills to teach and to learn are listed here. Teach them non-judgmental language. Teach them non-confrontational discourse. Teach them meta-language, which will not appear in the eyes of your interlocutor as being impolite and inappropriate. Teach them indirect discourse. And part of it all is the final sentence on this slide. I should always know my personal limits of acceptance and what I would do in case I reach them. And what I would do in case that I reach them without breaking up the relationship. If need be, breaking up the relationship might be without alternative, true enough, but the general approach is try to preserve a positive relationship in spite of differences in terms of culture and other things. And here are just a few examples of the training exercises we use and we suggest. So Judith mentioned what mistakes that really count. It's not grammar. And how do I deal with difficult situations without endangering a relationship? What do I write in a new relationship? How do I write my first wishes or perhaps even criticism? How do I say it in a way that does not demolish relationship? How do I say yes? How do I say no? Or what does mean yes on the other side and what does mean no on the other side? And what are my limits of acceptance? How tolerant can I be? That is the training field which we suggest when we look at cultures as discourse communities. And to sum it all up, one final quotation from the CFR companion volume: the aim of language education is no longer seen as simply to achieve mastery of 1 or 2 or even 3 languages, each taken in isolation with the ideal native speaker as the ultimate model. Instead, the aim is to develop a language repertory in which all language abilities have a place. And I replaced linguistic by language because linguistic in German, French, and other languages has a slightly different meaning than linguistic in English. So that is what they actually want to say. Language repertory, which all language abilities have a place. So thank you very much. And thank you, Judith, for your contribution. And now I think Judith and I will be very happy to receive your questions.